I did it again. I ticked off pro-lifers. Believe it or not, I don't intend to do that. I don't go around trying to do that. We're going to talk about IVF, that is in vitro fertilization, because, as you guys probably know, many pro-life individuals celebrate IVF. Many pro-life people believe that if you're opposed to IVF, that's in vitro fertilization, you're putting God in a box because you think that God loves babies and human lives, and there's any number of ways to create new human beings and new human lives. And so how could you be opposed to new ways to bring babies into the world? I thought you were pro-life. Wouldn't you celebrate that? I think that's wrong. And I think we need to talk about that because it's very important for us to be consistent in our pro-life worldview and to actually understand what that worldview represents. What does it mean to be pro-life? As our friend Katy Faust says, abortion and third-party reproductive technologies, or IVF, are two sides of the same child commodifying coin. Two sides of the same child commodifying coin. She says that abortion says that if I don't want a child, then I have the right to force that child out of existence. But then third-party reproductive technologies, or big fertility says, if I really want a child, I have the right to force the child into existence. So with both the baby making and the baby taking industry, the desires of adults are put before the needs and rights of children. One, their right to life. And then secondly, their right to their mother and father, their right to be raised by the two individuals responsible for their existence. Now, what some people will say at this point is they will say, well, Seth, how could you say that children have a right to their mother and father? Are you saying that if I adopt a child, that I have somehow denied my adoptive child a natural right? And this is an argument that many people opposed to in vitro fertilization and big fertility will get. I believe the many well-meaning pro-lifers are for in vitro fertilization because they haven't thought through it. And so when we make an argument based on the rights of children to their mother and father, people who have adopted children will say, oh, so because I adopted a kid, I denied them their right to their mother and father? No, that's not the same thing. You see, in the case of adoption, a tragedy happened, right? A tragedy happened. Someone died, or someone wasn't fit, or was a danger to their own biological child. And so another adult steps in and they adopt that child. And they're doing the best to love and care for children who have had to endure a tragedy for one reason or another, whether it was death or something else. The real parents are not able to raise the children. And so we do the best we can, right? But in the case of big fertility, we're actually arranging motherless and or fatherless children, right? In the case of adoption or with orphans, we're not trying to create motherless and fatherless children. We're dealing with a tragedy that happened that no one wanted to have happen. And then as good Christians, hopefully, we come along and we say, hey, I'll adopt those children, right? That's different than saying, hey, I'm a college-age student who wants to make a quick buck by masturbating and selling my sperm. And then that sperm is going to be used to create a child. And you as the father who was paid to give your sperm to someone else, that kid's going to grow up one day and wonder who their dad is. So you're in that case, you're actually arranging a fatherless child who will not have a relationship with their father and probably never even know who their real father was. So I hope you see that that's very different than adoption, okay? Being opposed to third-party reproductive technologies does not mean that you're opposed to adoption. Those are obviously very different. And so why should pro-life individuals be opposed to in vitro fertilization? Because it either compromises a child's right to life. Secondly, it may compromise a child's right to their mother and or father. And thirdly, it creates human beings as property, as things that can be frozen and stored in labs. And I believe human beings have a right to not be frozen, and they have a right to not be stored. That's not what we do with human beings, okay? So in the case of in vitro fertilization, in almost every case, what you are doing is you're creating, notice I said in almost every case in big fertility, when you're talking about in vitro fertilization, parents will create multiple embryos. Why? Because it's very expensive. In vitro fertilization is very expensive. And so because parents want to increase the likelihood that the wife is implanted, impregnated, gets a baby, they create 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, sometimes embryos, and then they'll release like 3 or 4 or 5 into mom to increase the likelihood that one baby will implant. So what are you doing in that circumstance? You're creating multiple human beings with the foreknowledge. The philosophical term is a priori. A priori, you're creating multiple human beings, knowing that many of them will become sacrificial lambs on the altar of your fertility. And yes, I said it that way. Knowing that many of them will become sacrificial lambs on the altar of your fertility. It's a wonderful thing to want a child. It's beautiful. But your desire for something that is innate, natural, and God-given does not mean you have the right to compromise children's rights. Does that make sense? It does not mean that you have a right to compromise children's rights. So now some of you are thinking, but I just did one embryo at a time. Yes, that's the argument, and morally, you can make that argument, okay? But before I get to that, when many couples will start with creating one embryo at a time. They'll start with creating one embryo at a time, and then they'll realize how cost prohibitive remaining morally consistent can be. It becomes very expensive because you create that one embryo, it doesn't implant. So you create another one embryo, it doesn't implant. This gets very expensive. So it is common, actually, because I'm in this movement enough to have heard the stories. It's quite common for couples who began trying to be morally upright and consistent and create one embryo at a time, who later kind of end up caving, and they create then they'll start creating multiple embryos because it's just too expensive to remain pure to their moral compass. So that's a problem. And then what do you do with the extra children that maybe you're planning for the next attempted implantation? Or what do you do with the children who are left over if the mom gets pregnant right away in the first attempt at in vitro fertilization? They're frozen. And our friend Katy Faust calls these souls on ice. Souls on ice, little babies, persons, people, human beings, frozen in labs. I believe, call me crazy guys, but I believe human beings have a right to not be frozen and stored in labs. So in the vast majority of circumstances, in vitro fertilization assumes or involves probably 2 different things. One, you're creating excess, additional, multiple human beings with the foreknowledge that not all of them, in fact, very few of them, will likely be born. So you're saying, well, it's unlikely that that one baby is going to implant if we only create one embryo. So let's create 5 embryos and see if one will implant. Well, in that case, you're willing to sacrifice up to 4 or 5 human beings on the altar of your fertility. That's not pro-life. Secondly, it's not pro-life to freeze human beings and store them in labs, okay? Now, some of you are thinking, well, Seth, what if we create one embryo at a time? Okay, yes, that's the other, they said the morally permissible way is to create one embryo at a time. If you can do in vitro fertilization in a way that doesn't compromise a child's right to life, doesn't compromise a child's right to their mother and father, and doesn't compromise their right to not be frozen and stored, then it can be morally permissible. But legally speaking, it will be impossible for us to ban every other way to do IVF, but keep that one legal carve out for the case in which two pro-life Christian mother and father are creating one embryo and trying to implant one embryo. I'm telling you, in our culture of death, legally that will be impossible. There is no way in which pro-lifers will somehow ban IVF except for when you create one embryo at a time and then try to implant the baby in the mother. That's not going to happen. We want that one carve out for the one way in which, yes, you can make a moral argument it's permissible, but there's no way that's going to happen. They're going to burst the door the rest of the way open to allow every other form and iterate or way to practice IVF, okay? And then, of course, IVF is often used in a very specific way that involves denying a child their right to their father, right? So it's very common. I mean, you ever wonder how gay people get kids, guys? You ever wonder how that happens? Right? Like two women, how did they get a baby? Two lesbian married couples. The way they got a baby was they paid for sperm, they bought sperm, they did IVF, and then they tried to implant babies in one of the lesbian couples' partners' wombs. That's literally planning to create a fatherless child. So all of this is wrong, okay? All of this is evil. You cannot be pro-life and also champion these things. And if you want that one little legal carve-out for creating one embryo at a time and implanting it into mom, legally that door is not going to remain just barely cracked open. So I hope that makes sense. That's why I'm opposed to IVF. I think we need to ban it. And I also think that more pro-life people should adopt. Yes, I know the statistics that most pro-life Christians adopt more than anyone else. That's true. About 2-to-1. Christians out-adopt the culture about 2-to-1. And yet, not nearly enough Christians are adopting. If you really want a child and you really want to love children, look at adoption. And it's crazy that it's cheaper to kill a kid than to adopt a kid. But this is what the local church should be involved in. But we shouldn't. Our desire for children or for a child should not take us so far that we're willing to compromise a child's right to life, a child's right to their mother and father, or a child's right to not be frozen and stored in a lab. So call me crazy, but that's my position. I'm sticking to it. If you disagree, feel free to send us any arguments or thoughts to the contrary. But I think I've made a pretty airtight case. I don't think if you're pro-life, I don't think you'll be able to prove me wrong. But I do love listening to alternative opinions, and we'll always listen to an argument to the contrary. But listen, just because we're pro-life and we love babies doesn't mean that any way you bring a child into existence is permissible. Does not mean that any way you bring a child into existence is permissible. All right, guys. Well, thanks for tuning in. Go look at our episode with Katy Faust on the Unaborted with Seth Gruber podcast from a few weeks ago. Unaborted podcast. And check out this Instagram reel from the other day here on my Instagram. Katy Faust making her argument. Go put your opinions, drop your comments in there. Let's get some good conversations going.